everybody. I know I'm the only thing standing between you and a grab-and-go lunch. So my name's Stephen Venaria. I'm an SVP in Customer Success. So my role basically is to help all of you to be successful with our platform and basically to make sure that you get the most value from it possible. I've been in Appian for over a decade now, and this is a topic I'm really passionate about, and that specifically is how do you actually prove you're getting value from the platform? So if I was to go to you and say, are you getting value from Appian? How could we actually drill down and prove that? So it's something my team and I have worked on for well over a decade, and I'm excited to talk about it today with you. So what I was going to do is actually start this conversation with an article I read in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. And the reason I wanted to share this isn't so much about Johnson & Johnson, it's about discussions I've had in this conference the last couple of days, but also conversations we've really had for the better part of the last year. And so what the article is about is, it gets into basically how Johnson & Johnson is making a change in how they spend on AI initiatives. And so the two highlighted sections here I'll just call out is that basically what they're doing is they've decided they want to allocate their resources to the highest value AI use cases. And the reason for that is, that's a no-brainer, right? They obviously want to put the money to where the most value is going to come from. But the reason they're saying this is a pivot is they say they've gone back and they've looked at their AI spend so far, and they've identified that only 10 to 15% of the initiatives that they've funded deliver 80% of the value. Or another way to look at that could be is to say 85 to 90% have not delivered on the ROI that they expected. And so they're basically making a change of how it is that they approach funding these projects and deciding which projects to do. So the reason I like this article is, it's a good prologue to what we're going to talk about, and at the end we'll actually have an epilogue that's still contained in this story. But the other reason that I like it is that it picks up on a lot of points, if you read the article, that we've talked about in this conference for the last couple of days, and also is basically impacting all of our customers, which is, first of all, there's a lot of hype around AI, right? So everyone's got to figure out what the right way is to use AI in their company. But the hype makes it sometimes confusing and noisy to figure out where is the right place to spend and how do you prove you're actually getting value from it. The second point, which is sort of a conflicting goal, is money right now is really expensive. Okay, so it's actually not as easy right now to actually fund projects as it was, say, a decade ago when we were in a world of lower interest rates and money was cheap. The third thing, though, the third theme in here that's talked about briefly, and I've talked to a lot of the customers the last couple of days and over the last year, is that leaders are really under extreme pressure right now to prove that the things they're doing actually deliver for their companies. This is much more than it was, again, just maybe 5 years ago. And it's largely due to we're just in a different environment right now in terms of the cost of money. So I think it's a great prologue, and we'll return to this story at the very end. So for now, we'll just keep it in your mind. But to segue, I think the other element that this story brings up is it's an element for discussion, right? It raises an interesting question, which I was hoping to pose to the group here today. So I don't know if there's any brave souls out there to go, but to answer this question, if you do a project today, how do you actually measure the success of your digital transformation or whatever the project is that you've been asked to deliver, or maybe that you've handed to one of your teams to deliver? Are there any brave souls in the room that want to raise their hand and say, how you do this today? How do you measure success of a project or a program or an application? Any volunteers?
One of the ways that we use is the 3E methodology, where we're looking at efficiency, effectiveness, and experience for the users, and really how we can quantify everything we're doing. And we try to do that not at the tail end where we're really measuring success. We're using it as a gatekeeper to say which way we want to go into that project, and then use it as a measure after we come out of it, see did adoption meet our needs? Are we actually getting ROIs that we expected to see? And is the throughput actually meeting expected volumes as well?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. And Casey's not a plant, but Casey, do you allowed to say where you work?
No. I happen to work with Johnson & Johnson. So it's worked out well.
Yeah, this was not a plant. Johnson & Johnson does have a really mature methodology. That's actually the initial reason when the article caught my eye to read it, just because I know from working with Casey and team, they're very advanced in how they approach this. So they have a really good method for how they measure it, measuring actual value and ROI. All right, I'll go through an example then, basically, of what we've observed over the years. Essentially, is that a lot of programs follow this pattern. So first up is an executive has an initiative, right? A goal, essentially a really important goal driven by either the context that the company competes in or maybe market forces in general. So in this example, we have the executive has a goal of improve efficiency. Okay. What happens then is this step here is oversimplified in the diagram, obviously, but essentially they go through a step of what is some type of upfront requirements gathering. Now, this could be just high-level vision, depending on what the methodology is that the organization uses. It could also be actually big upfront requirements. We're working right now with a bank in Canada that's actually been basically doing a requirements process for well over a year to make sure that they document every single use case they anticipate will be in their future design system. But something happens essentially in this to turn the fuzzy front end of an initiative into something that feels a little more precise, it feels more specific. And so a lot of times that's captured in something called software specs, a lot of times developed by maybe a team of business analysts. And this could also be, and sometimes it could be also, this is actually the stage that they're going to go and ask for funding as they get more clarity around it is, or sometimes it could have been the funding was already approved and they've now moved on to this stage. But either way, there's sort of this element of usually the actual developers aren't involved yet and someone's gone off or some team's gone off and actually started to articulate a little bit better what it is that they're going to do to theoretically achieve this idea of improving efficiency. And so then at that point, what happens is after they've gone through that making things a little bit more clear, they'll hand it off and or work with the development team to actually start to build this, right? And nowadays, everyone does Agile, right? Scrum has really won the methodology wars, are kind of well behind us. It's been around for 25 years. So the team goes off and does things usually in some type of Agile fashion. It looks different depending on the corporation's context, their culture, and also their own methodology. But essentially, the team ideally gets to a state where they get to a go live, right? And there's a lot of things that happen, obviously, between the idea of standing up a project and actually getting to go live. Usually this is where all the challenges happen in a project. These are usually never as simple as they seem, but when you get to go live, it's time for usually a sigh of relief or a breath because it's a really meaningful milestone. And I think really at most times we see this story play out, I would say most projects really stop here. I mean, the idea of essentially, did you achieve value? At this stage, if you've gotten to go live, the answer is normally going to be a yes, or maybe a probably. And the project is sort of deemed successful, or probably more so if you really drill down into how it's being determined as success. It's more by qualitative measures, right? Either people feel good about it, there's maybe some marketing literature written about it. It stands more on a subjective side of things. However, what we find is most times with these projects, if you actually are brave enough to ask the questions and really inspect it and say, if we want to inspect this and we want you to prove to us you delivered value, so prove to us in this example, you actually improved efficiency, can you do it? How would you do it? And in this case, I think what we normally see for answers, if you're again brave enough to ask the question of the executive for that got the funding for this project, one of three things a lot of times plays out. The first is, well, if you're really being hard on me and asking me to prove it, I'm not really sure I could. I don't really have an answer to that question because I know it is because I've heard a lot of great things from people and I've read the reports, maybe from the project team or maybe from our marketing department. So I'm not sure I could prove it to you, but I get a feeling it's good and I just can't answer the question. The second answer, which is the one I've alluded to, is you get really subjective answers. And even though you continue to prove this, a lot of the answers you get are still more on the fuzzy side of, well, we think that we know we're doing more work with the same amount of people and therefore we know we improved efficiency, but it wouldn't necessarily stand up to the rigor of real true inspection. And the third one, which does happen as well, is a lot of times the executive at this stage actually has moved on. They're not there anymore. They've vanished. They maybe have gotten promoted to another position, or they've maybe moved on to another company, but they're not there to actually audit for it. So I'll pause for a minute. Does this resonate with anyone? Does anyone see kind of, if you think through the stages that some of your programs go through, does this resonate and you've seen similar things or at least can relate to it? Okay, see some people shaking their heads. So the reason this happens is that we believe this illustration helps explain the reason this happens. On the left, this diagram, the box that's called measure by output, this is largely the world that we live in today. Okay, so the idea here is that most of the way that we think about programs, most of the way we think about project initiatives inside non-digital companies is that we really focus on the idea of scope, cost, and time, right? This is the iron triangle most of us have learned at some stage of our careers or maybe even in our education. And the idea here is that as long as you fit within this triangle, we're going to declare it success. We know how to measure. Essentially, if we've delivered on scope, we have these methodologies around requirements, traceability matrices. We have all these ways that we can measure maybe even function points if you're as old as I do and think back to those times. But there's ways that you understand how to measure scope and that you've delivered what the scope was of the project. You know how to measure the cost. That's a budgeting exercise. And then you know how to measure time. while these things are all really important on the left, the challenge is that you could hit it out of the park on all three of these elements. You could nail it on scope, you could do it even under budget, and maybe even you could do it under time and faster. And the challenge is that if you actually get back to the idea of inspecting of, can you prove to us you delivered value? A lot of times you actually have not done that. And in fact, you could deliver on these elements and actually have made the world a worse place because you might have actually built the wrong thing, right? And I think if anyone's been on a project before that went through all these challenges and got to go live, sometimes you can look back at what you've delivered and think it maybe didn't actually live up to the expectations we had, but people may not talk about that too much. And so on the right-hand side is a concept that's less common, but this is really where we're trying to push, when we work with a lot of our customers, is this idea of don't only measure the idea on the left. It's important. You certainly cannot ignore it. No one has unlimited budget, no unlimited time. But instead, if you get this idea of measuring by outcome as well, which in this context would mean business outcome. How do you prove you've delivered the actual value that you were asked to deliver, or essentially the funding was given to you for? So to drive this point home, I'm going to pause for a minute and just ask for a raise of hands to two questions. First off, maybe how many people work at a company, either you're at a partner organization or your own company, where you actually have a methodology that you use to manage projects? Show of hands. How many people work at a company that has a methodology to manage projects? Okay, most everyone's hands go up. Now the next question to kind of drive the point home is, how many people work at a company that has a methodology to manage value? JC, I expect. Okay, so really I think just Johnson & Johnson probably in the room raised their hands. And so that's where we kind of see this happen is that if you really step back and think of it, there's not really mature methodologies out there in this concept of how do you manage value, yet it's arguably the most important thing to what it is all of us in this room do when we're working in digital transformation. Value is really the thing that matters the most. However, it lives in a world where it's just sort of unknown and unseen, and we largely talk about it in subjective and maybe less mature ways than really the importance of it should declare. So keep this in mind. This is also, if you go to the internet and just search for it, a lot of times people call this the idea of moving to a product operating model. And the reason I mention that, as I know from working with a lot of our customers, is that a lot of organizations are moving their org structure to this idea of what's called a product operating model. At the heart of it, I would argue, like the key ethos of that, although this isn't always clear from the driving of that change, is it really is to move to an organization that does measure its success more by outcome than by output. So the other element I want to make sure, I know we just went through that and only one organization raised their hands that they have a method for managing value. To let you know, you're not alone. In fact, you're really totally in the majority on this. So there's an interesting article from the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago that's actually an excerpt from a book by a gentleman named Ben Flyberg. And he does these studies on all these really large programs and really large projects. And what he came away with that analysis was that he determined 99.5% of projects deliver under benefits. Okay, it's like a staggering number. So he goes through and he looks at this and says over 50% are over budget. And then, the remaining 50%, close to 48, are on budget. And then even less of those are on budget and then on time. And then very, very few are at benefits. And the reason, actually, if you read the book you wrote on this, one of the main reasons he gives for this is really simple. It's what we just talked about a minute ago, which is most projects that he looks at or programs he looks at don't actually even have a plan to actually measure for the benefits. So even if the programs did deliver it, the reality is there's no way to prove it because no one actually went into the starting of the initiative with an actual approach and a plan to figure out how they would measure for those benefits. So don't feel embarrassed if you didn't raise your hand on that second part of the question. You're in the far, far majority of organizations. Almost no one does this. So a question now I wanted to raise is, if I just mentioned if value is the ultimate most important thing, and yet it's invisible to most of us, that's pretty shocking. So why is that? Why don't projects deliver verifiable value? If you actually go and inspect them, why is it you can't verify they delivered value? What do you think? Any brave souls want to raise their hand and answer why it is they don't deliver value?
Because sometimes it's uncertain what we are aiming for. It might be multiple variables that we want to target, and it's a wide scope of invisible.
Yeah, totally. It's unclear what we're going to do, and also there's many variables, right? So a lot of times it's even unclear which ones really matter, right? Is that in line with what you're saying as well? Yeah, totally. How about others? Anyone else know why it is that we can't verify value on programs we do? From a light?
We often struggle to measure in the current state because we don't have attributes to measure it with. We know where we want to go to, and we have KVPs that we want to get to, but we can't measure it today.
This is a great example. So baselines are really elusive, right? We see this all the time of that the current situation is bad, but it's really hard to quantify how bad it is. And then of course it becomes more difficult to verify how much you've improved because you don't know where you started with. So we'll come back to that point because we certainly see that all the time and do have an answer for how you can at least improve upon that, even though it's not a precise answer. What else? What other reasons is it that the most important point of our programs is invisible to us and we don't actually manage it? We've looked at this and we have a long list of reasons, or not a long list, we have 10 reasons we see most often. I was going to dive in just to kind of dive into the 3 that are most salient to today's discussion. The reasons in green, these are the 3 most common reasons that we see that are salient to today's discussion. The first one, there's no insight into how business value will actually be created. And I'm sorry, this speaks to your point earlier, is that it's not really clear exactly, like we understand if today's situation is bad and we understand that we can improve it, but it's not really clear exactly what it is we're doing that will drive the value that we've been asked to deliver, right, in that ROI. So that idea of improving efficiency early, no one's really taken the time to tease out what is it that really matters. To your point earlier, there's lots of variables. And so if we try to focus on every one of them, that's probably not going to be a recipe for success because it's probably too much to do at once. And some of the variables might even cancel each other out. So a number one reason is a really simple one, is no one's really taken the time to draw a causal link between the value that we've been asked to deliver and what it is that's come up in those early vision documents or those software specs of what is the future world will be with. There's just sort of a gap between them. And a lot of times that's a reality of 2 different organizations are probably doing that work. One organization came up with the ROI, a different organization came in and actually came up with what the future should look like. And to be honest, the third organization probably comes in and actually delivers it. So this is one reason we see that's really salient to today. The second item, number 4, organizations might only be good at actually estimating the ROI. So although I mentioned before, there's not really great work out there, improving methodologies for managing value, there are approaches, right, to actually measuring estimating an ROI, right? Anyone that went to any kind of business school at some point learned this concept of NPV and different ways you can actually come up with ROI metrics. And so the organizations are sometimes good at these. We have a team here, a value engineering team, that's fantastic at it, and they actually work a lot with our clients, and they also collaborate with us to make sure that we can define this in a way that has a really good focus to it. But by and large, what this speaks to is we have at least some way of measuring stuff early, whether it's perfect or not. We have some way of doing it, but then we don't have a way once we've got the money. It's almost like the problem's gone away. I got the funding I needed, and therefore my work is done. I don't need to worry about actually going back and verifying it later. So there's no step to go through and actually confirm it. The third reason also speaks to your point earlier, which is we're measuring too many things, and we're measuring too many things not connected to value. So you see this a lot in the idea of you'll basically come up with plans where it's like, we know we need to measure cycle time, we need to measure throughput, or maybe just, if you're in delivery stage, everyone talks about success in the form of story points. I mean, don't get me started of how many projects I see where story points is the proxy for assuming there's value. That's the same thing as before with the idea of the iron triangle. It's the same problem. You're just managing outputs. So story points on their own aren't value. There's a huge hypothesis or assumption that's going into that. Velocity is another way we see people talk about it. So especially agile teams really get into that. But the idea here is that people are just measuring things, but they're really not measuring things that are connected to value. They're just measuring things that are measurable. And that actually can be worse sometimes than not measuring anything, because a lot of times you get hyper-focused on things that could be counterproductive to value. So these are the things that we most frequently see of why more organizations aren't able to go back and verify the value of the things that they built. So if we kind of fast forward to this idea of what would the world look like if we actually had a way that we were really mature about making sure that we delivered programs that we could go back and we can verify we in fact delivered the right thing and we delivered it to overachieve on what the ROI was. This is sort of what it would look like if we think back to that earlier graphic. The first step is the executive articulates a goal, and you can see this is called out in green to identify some differences in the first stages that we went through. In this example, you can see the goal here is $10 million in cost savings. If you remember the previous version, the idea was improving efficiency. So this here is articulated in a way that's more precise, right? It's also going to be easier to measure, although I don't want you to necessarily think we're going to measure this thing, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the core here is that there's more time articulating what this is. So instead of getting that vague improved efficiency measurement, you're getting something more precise. Now, what I would argue is Most times that companies go and get funding, this in fact is articulated well. The challenge is it actually goes through kind of a dissonance chamber, and by the time it gets to the delivery team, it turns into improved efficiency. And so you've kind of lost some of the clarity here that's really important. So in this example though, we have the clear reason that this project exists and the why behind it. The next stage is the really important piece of this. So instead of moving into a world where you go through maybe the idea of creating a lot of documents or handing this off maybe to a separate business analyst team, what we work with our customers on and highly recommend people do this is you actually enter design sprints, right? Maybe a design sprint or multiple design sprints. But this is a period of intense discovery where you merge together business and developers to come up with basically understanding the why behind the program and also figuring out what it is that you need to build. And from this exercise, one really important thing that should appear is what we call an impact metric, or other times we'll call a North Star metric. And that's shown here. It's articulated as 97% of invoices posted within 5 days. What this essentially, this metric does is this connects the ROI that you want to achieve with the behavior change that the team that builds the application or the program that you're initiating, the behavior change they need to drive. Because this is the really important thing that needs to be their North Star. If you give them a North Star of get to $10 million of cost savings, it's way too noisy. It's going to be really complicated for them to figure out. But if you get in a room and sit down with them and start to brainstorm how they might do that, really talented teams will emerge with key behavior change that needs to happen, okay? And so this North Star metric, if you want to think of the really important qualities of this to know you've hit it, it's that it's the most important point to influence large behavior change, right? In system engineering, this is known as a leverage point, okay? It is basically a single metric, and it does the best job of capturing the value that's going to be derived from your applications. Okay, that's one point though, is that it's the most important point that drives behavior change. Two is it's within the application or the program's sphere of influence, okay? This is really important. The $10 million cost savings in this that starts it, that's not in the team's sphere of influence. The reason it's not in the team influence is you might need to actually reduce headcount, and I can guarantee that dev team is probably not accountable to actually remove the headcount. So they need to focus on a goal they can influence and they can be held accountable to. And so in that case, that's the North Star metric for them, is that it's within their sphere of influence. The application they build can 100% control that behavior change. The third thing is it's also a leading indicator of revenue. So the leading part of this is also really important, which is most times your revenue goals, which are for the most part going to be what your ROI is based on, whether it's cost cutting, cost containment, revenue growth, or just revenue protection, those are going to be lagging. In most cases, they could be 3 to 5 years out, right? So you want to find a way that you can get leading indicators, because no one wants to wait 3 to 5 years to figure out if the program that you've delivered is in fact verifiably successful. So the really important other really important criteria of this metric is that it's a leading indicator of revenue. So I paused on this for quite a while because this might look simple in a graphic such as this, which is intentionally simple, but I will say this takes time. It's hard to actually get this out of a room of people, and it's always harder than it looks when you go into it, especially when you look at the after effects. You think, well, that seems really obvious. The reality is it takes a lot of collaboration and brainstorming of individuals that really know the domain well, both the business domain and also the technology domain, meaning what you actually can do with the technology. So after you moved out of this design sprint, then naturally the team's still doing agile, so you go in and deliver via sprints or via Scrum. And then in this model, the go live is still an important milestone, but it's really table stakes, because this is just the start of the journey to get to value at this stage, okay? It's an important milestone to get to, but by no means does it mean you've achieved your end goal. So here what happens is, a piece I should back up in, a piece I didn't talk about is also during that design sprint, the team is figuring out the right way to instrument what it is they're building. So you can basically start to get leading indicators from it. So you can get metrics out of the thing you're building. And the first metrics you want to get to, which I'll show in a minute, is actually adoption, making sure people are using what it is that you've built. They're using it in a way where you anticipate, and really important, the CSAT piece as well, that they enjoy using it. Because if they don't, there could be challenges for you to work through that may not be apparent initially. So essentially you've built the way, through that design sprint, you've identified ways to instrument it. So when you go live, you're getting this invisible world, you're starting to get the early indicators, the very first leading indicators of whether or not you're on the right track. And what shouldn't be surprising is, in most cases, you're not going to be totally on the right track. A lot of the assumptions you made in your design sprints, they're probably going to prove false or slightly off kilter, right? So you need to go back and probably make some adjustments after you've gone live with this. And that's why it's so important you instrument it. If you don't have the instrumentation, you'll be blind to this. And other than assumptions that people are using it the way you want, you won't really know, and you won't know what to change. So this is really what Agile is meant to be, is get people using the system, learn from how they're using it, and figure out where some of your assumptions were incorrect and make adjustments to get back on track. So after this point, and by the way, in terms of timeline, in a perfect world, you're getting this information like 1 to 2 weeks after you've gone live with this, and you're ideally making changes to it just as fast as you can to get updates out the door, and repeating this iteratively for as fast as you can. But eventually you get to a stage where you're comfortable this application or this program is essentially being used the way that it should be used to deliver on the ROI. And you can go back now and verify the outcomes, right? Now, these outcomes that you're verifying, to get back to that earlier point of a North Star metric, they will point back to the behavior change was just in the team's control, okay? That's the thing that you're verifying. So in this example, which I'll dive into this use case, or this case study rather, in detail to explain it. In this case, what that means is 97% of the invoices are being posted within 5 days. That's the core leverage point the team identified, and they've built the system with instrumentation so they can actually go and verify that. So this is, in a perfect world, what this method, what the world would look like if you have a way to manage value. And the thing that I just want to highlight, because I can't stress it enough, is the most important element to this method is to work on those design sprints and identify that leverage point that's going to drive the behavior change, because it's a disproportionate influence on your ROI. And it's also something which I don't want to lose sight of. It's also the thing that keeps your teams aligned as they're building. Anyone that's been through, complex transformation programs knows they get noisy and teams get distracted very quickly. Sometimes product owners lose sight of what it is that they're trying to achieve. And so this really important leverage point, of this clear metric, becomes a thing that teams, when they argue about what to build or how to design something, they always need to point back to this North Star and say, that's the thing that we're getting towards. So anything we're doing that's not aligned with that, we have to question why we're doing it. So it looks simple, but I want to stress it's not. It takes a lot of time to figure out what these metrics are, and it is iterative, and there will be good arguments in the room if you get the right people involved. So what I'll move on to now is to kind of make that abstract idea a little bit more concrete. I'll talk about a case study of a customer we worked with. So this customer, this is a use case that's concrete because I think it's easier kind of everyone to relate no matter what industry you're in. This is a construction management company. So for context, what they've done is they've negotiated terms with their suppliers. They have favorable payment terms for them, which is if they pay their invoice, they make payments within 30 days of receipt of an invoice from one of their suppliers, they get a hefty discount off those supplies. It's one thing they negotiated where they thought we'll be able to make more money on our projects as long as we're efficient with our payment to our suppliers. And so when we got engaged with them, they pulled us in because they had noticed that most of their invoices were actually paid outside of that 30-day window. So they were actually being paid 45 to 90 days. And when I say most, more than 90% of the payments were going out at that time. So they knew they were leaving a lot of money on the table, and the problem was only getting worse because the good news for them is they were growing. The bad news is that growth was leading to even longer timelines around when they made payment. So they came up with a really simple metric from when they did their ROI analysis on this, which is if they could just pay more of their invoices on time, or before 30 days, I'm sorry, because they were still on time, but if they could pay them early, so within 30 days, they estimated it was at least $10 million more they could get annually, okay? So it's a good kind of meaty, like we talked about earlier, very clear business objective that they're going for. So what I'm going to show you in the next slide is, I talked about the importance of really working in that design sprint to come up with the ways that you're going to measure value so you can verify it. And so one of the key exercises that we work on is this concept of a value map, or sometimes you'll also hear us talk about it as an impact map. What this is through those design discussions, when you're figuring out what world it is that you're going to create together, you basically create essentially a causal chain, or really a correlation chain, if you will, of first starting with what the business outcome is, then getting to a stage of what it is, the behavior change you want to drive, and the next level is what features are we going to build that drive the behavior change. So that's what you're looking at here. This is really the key to that design sprint. And I'll walk through this in detail because I know it's a little bit of a wordy slide. The first part here is that we have the business outcome. So as we talked about, this is a lagging indicator. In the example we have here, this is actually a relatively fast instance where the idea is $10 million in 12 months. And just to drive it even clearer, let's assume it's 12 months after the go live, and let's assume the go live is actually just a 3-month project, just for the sake of simplicity. So if you want to articulate it differently, you could say $10 million in 15 months, but for this example, we'll remove the build time from it. So this anyways, it's lagging. When you start the project, you're not going to know this for over a period of a year. So then what the team did is when they got in a room and really started to hash it out how it was that they would achieve this, they're going to come up with what that North Star metric is, or that impact metric. And in this case, it's going to be the thing, again, that connects what it is the delivery team is going to do, what behavior change they're going to drive, that's going to deliver on that $10 million cost savings, okay? And it's really important that this is getting more leading, right? You'll be able to prove this earlier than you will the actual business outcome. And in this case, they came up with 97% of invoices are posted within 5 days. Now, I don't know if anyone notices, if they recall, in the start of the case study, what I said was they had to make payments within 30 days. So hopefully, maybe if you look at this, you think, well, that's weird. Why wouldn't you just make that the North Star metric? Does anyone know why maybe the North Star metric is actually 97% of invoices are posted in 5 days, as opposed to payments made within 30 days? Does anyone know? Want to take a guess? Brave souls? Okay. So the reason is that if you remember, I talked about a good North Star metric or a good impact metric. It has to be something within the team's controls. And when everyone gets together in a design sprint, what the developers actually know in this case is the system, the Appian system they're building, it does not actually make the payments. That actually happens in an ERP. Appian has an integration to it where it will post the invoices right to the ERP. That's within the team's control. Once it goes in the ERP, that project team, that development team had no influence over what the ERP did. And so they determined the thing that they thought was going to be most effective way to prove that they could deliver the ROI, which was in their control, was that they needed to post invoices to that system within 5 days. So that's why the North Star metric in this example is a posting invoices metric, or is a metric about posting invoices. It is not a metric about actually making payments. Payments are outside of their control. It happens in a different system. However, the people that do the payments are in the room, and they're agreeing that if we can achieve this, right, and make post these invoices in 5 days, they're going to be able to pay that out in the remaining 25 days to get that, to achieve that early discount. So this is why I like this example, is it shows this in a really simple way, this idea of why it's super important you figure out what it is the team can actually control. Because remember, they're going to instrument their application to prove that they're achieving this and getting measurements from it. So the next level that you work through essentially in this value map is getting a North Star metric is hard, or the impact metric is hard, but one thing you're figuring out there is what's the actual features you're going to build that will drive that behavior change, right? And so in this case, this application has far more features in it, as most do, but when you really start to remove the noise and focus on the signal, what you realize is there's usually just a handful of features that really matter most, and that's the thing that everyone's energy needs to be focused on from a measurement standpoint. So that's why in this example here, we just have these 5 features essentially. Those are the ones that are the most important to drive the idea of getting 97% invoices posted. And this is not a coincidence, but the first one, if you look at it, is the idea of using AI to essentially extract information from the invoices they receive from their suppliers. So this use case was in fact one of our early success stories around invoicing. The second one actually is just moving their suppliers to get them to actually email essentially their invoices as opposed to other methods. That's a critical element for them, and say they had ways outside the system that they actually worked to make sure that happened. And then mobile approvals was an easy one. Again, time's running, so if we can add mobile approvals, so maybe someone doesn't miss a day because they're out and about running around to sales calls or whatever. Well, not sales calls because it's finance, but they're running around that day. They can still get an approval in relatively easily because it's just on their phone, as opposed to waiting until the next day when they actually get their laptop booted. So these are some of the features that the team identified they thought were most important to driving the behavior change. And then what's really important here again is because we want leading indicators, the adoption, they built in adoption of these features because they think these are the most important things that are going to drive a better world for us. We need to make sure we build in and instrument our systems so we can get really good reports out of this. And so we have a simple method we go through. I think if you get into the world of adoption metrics, if everyone's ever spent some time in this, you can really get down a rat hole very quickly. And so we've identified a really simple methodology to try to make it simpler to pick some metrics that matter from an adoption standpoint. And so what this is showing in this example, just to pull one of them, is there's a depth metric, which is 80% of the invoices extract about five or more fields. that's one thing they can look at very early. So when they go live, they can almost immediately start to see how are we trending towards that 80% target. Are we above it? Are we below it? And earlier on, there was a gentleman, I think from Alight, mentioned that one of the questions here is, do we know our baselines or not? And so this is an example here where the team, this case, they don't know their baselines. We didn't have great data on that, but we're largely figuring on a whiteboard what we think makes sense. That's a hypothesis. And again, because we're instrumenting the system, we can go back later and start to look at it and try to work with the customer and figure out, is this the right baseline or not? Sometimes the baseline is actually the thing that's going to be wrong, not necessarily the actual measurement itself. So this is the way that you can start to very early on know if you're on the right track. You're probably going to have to make adjustments at this stage after a couple of weeks of usage and make changes. And the thing ultimately about this method that we really like is, because Appian is a process platform, that's always been what it is we are, the system itself automatically collects a lot of metrics for us that we can capture. So for us, the idea of AI and process, which Matt talked about a lot, the reason we think process is so powerful is process is the way you drive behavior change. And so for us, this is a really easy thing to kind of build into our system, is making sure we can capture these metrics. And then it's more a matter of using the methodology to figure out which metrics matter most so we can bring those to the top. So essentially, this is the process that we go through in the value map stage. And to show what that looks like in this example, this is what we call an impact dashboard. So we talked about how important it is to go through and actually instrument what it is you're building. So if we work on this from the idea of which ones you're going to get indication of first, so kind of early indicators first, you see down here we have the satisfaction. So this is a really simple way we'll poll users to figure out if they in fact like the application or not. So in this example, 84% are saying they like it, so we know we're on the good track. If we're not in a good track, right, we've got to go and investigate this. And the thing about CSAT that's fantastic is you can actually get information from UAT on this really early, right? You get a lot of great data before you even go live, and you can very quickly understand what it is people may not like about it. You thought it was a great system, what is it? A lot of times this points to some UX issues the team may not have identified, to be honest with you. So then what comes up is your adoption metrics. These are essentially, again, the leading indicators. This is going to validate that the system's being used the way that you anticipate it to be used. And so if you look at this, the idea of baselines we talked about earlier, it might be kind of small, but this example here, one of the adoption metrics they picked for one of the few features that mattered most is the percentage of invoices extracting more or equal to 5 fields. They came up with an 80% baseline they thought was the threshold they had to hit to make this to be effective. And you can see that baseline in gray, and then above it in green is the fact that in this example, they're at 81%. So it's green because they're slightly over the baseline metric. But again, sometimes you're going to have to, and most times you're going to have to assume what that baseline is. And then through observing it finally, when you get the application out there, you're going to need to make adjustments to it. But this here is early indications. You're ideally getting this 2 weeks into the project, and you're identifying if you're on the right track or not. And you're going to figure out certain parts that you need to make some adjustments to the application. And then in a perfect world, a month, 2 months, 3 months out, you're then going to be able to measure the actual critical behavior change. So in this example, because the team built, again, within their sphere of influence, they built instrumentation in, they can tell here what percentage of those invoices are being achieved within 5 days. And so in this example, you can see when they first rolled out, they're below that target, and then through some instrumentation and some adjustments, they're getting the system to be higher on that. And this is a perfect metric. I like this one a lot in this example because it's a monthly metric, so that means you can get really early indications of it. So that's another part of when you think of these defining what your North Star metric is. You want to get things that have faster time spans because it's going to be easier to figure out what you might need to change, which is ultimately going to make you successful faster. And so this is basically what we talk about when we say this is the method that we use to manage value. And so to talk about this in the context of how it is that we deliver projects, this is what our methodology looks like at the highest level. So I would argue most projects that get implemented have kind of the first 3 phases, some type of shaping phase where you go off and probably get the budget and you make a business case, you kind of figure out how big the project is, put some estimation behind it. Initiation is you're going to stand things up, right? A lot of times this is a sprint 0. You're going to get into it and actually start things off. And then you implement, and that's when you actually go through and build what you need to build and actually get to a go live. The pieces that we've worked over the last several years to really refine on are these latter 2 phases that we think are the critical elements to get to a stage where you're managing value. The first is the verify piece. So the idea here is you're going to basically verify adoption and achieving impact, the impact metric or the North Star metric. That's what I just walked you through today. And that's going to be the thing that you can prove and say, I delivered my ROI. But another piece that we didn't talk to today, just because of time, is there's another stage that matters equally as much, which is an optimization phase that you would go through. This is where the idea of process insights in our platform really play a powerful role, which is once you know that you've built the right thing, you can verify value early, then it's time to basically continually optimize that. So the idea is, don't let these applications just run without any changes and just assume that in 5 years you'll build something new. You can eke out more and more value through process insights and through the idea of continually optimizing what it is you built. You'll find other areas of the app that maybe aren't that North Star metric, but are other pieces that are really important to optimizing in areas where you can get even more value from it. So we believe that those two stages become the way that you can get the absolute most value from our platform. And we've had a lot of success stories with customers doing this. So this is the stuff that we're really proud of having built the last several years. That works well with our product. To close things out with the prologue and the Johnson & Johnson story, the reason I really like this was at the end of the story, it talks about how Johnson & Johnson is now in fact funding or tracking funding essentially in progress for what it's funding. So what they talk about is they're tracking progress in 3 buckets. And those 3 buckets are successful deployment, wide adoption, and business outcomes. So the reason I love the article was it caught my eye right away, because if you follow the other part of the presentation, that's really what we're saying measuring value is all about. Is first, you got to get to successful deployments, right? That's just step 1, that's table stakes. 2 is the next stage in that value journey is going to be making sure adoption is there, making sure people are using it the way that you anticipate they would, or if not, figure out what needs to change. Maybe your hypothesis was wrong, or maybe there's just something wrong with the UX, but you need to get to adoption. And then the third level would be actually achieving the business outcome. If I was to go back and talk to Johnson & Johnson, maybe the one change would be is actually add a 4th bucket, which would be we're actually optimizing and continue to tailor it even more to eke out even more value from what it is we've built. But anyways, I thought the article might resonate because it really maps well to our methodology that we walked through today. And with that, I'll close it out for questions.
One of the slides before the case study slide talked about the life cycle of any project or a product, right? Mm-hmm. So if there are large transformation projects, a program, let's say an SAP moving to S4HANA, at which stage are you really confident that we are on the right track to achieve the value or the value that should be coming out of the end of the program? Sometimes it could be a tech debt or a technology modernization, or there could be other factors as well, right?
Yep.
Especially given you talked about a case study about the savings. Mm-hmm. So for these large programs, what is it that you can showcase to a senior leadership saying, hey, we are on the right track, you need to continue to invest in this?
Yeah, so I think the first time you'll get that will be actually at your design sprints. A lot of times, like you'd be amazed, that really simple value map I showed you, you'll be amazed how much times we work with customers on that, and we actually realize that there's not good it's really what you're doing is you're mapping hypotheses to get to the point of what it is you're doing to figure out how it traces back to value. That's actually usually your first point. You're going to realize that you could be on the right track or you actually might be on the wrong track. We have had programs before that totally change the direction they're on, because when people map it out, they actually start to question what it is they're doing, and they realize there's actually major gaps or flaws in their thinking initially. And we've had a handful of projects in the last couple of years that have totally pivoted and actually built an entirely different thing based on just that simple exercise. And I mean, to me, it's almost amazing just how simple it is to do that, but because people skip it, they miss out on a really important pivot they could make. So I'd say that's step 1 without a doubt on it. Now, really large programs, the reality is you're going to have this depending on what the program structure is. You're probably going to have multiple teams doing this exercise, and it all depends what your program structure is. But that's going to be your first indicator. After that, in a perfect world, you're also figuring out a way to push those leading indicators as early as possible. And in a perfect world, you're getting something out to production or at least out to UAT early, so you can start getting readout from what the adoption metrics look like in the CSAT metrics. So usage is going to be the next point that you're going to get some information from. And the really important thing there is find ways creatively to get early usage. If you're doing a large port like you're talking about, where you maybe can't find a way to implement incrementally, find a way to do something in UAT at least, because even though it's not the best answer, it's going to be better than not doing it. And it's going to get you some clarity around things you might need to change. Anyone else? Okay, I'll be here if anyone wants to swing up to the stage afterwards and ask some questions. But thank you all for your time. Hope you all have safe travels back, and hope you enjoyed the conference.